increasing. But how does Australia compare to the rest of the world? Well, we've done the sums and the conversions. We've found it is more expensive to buy a litre of milk here than it is in the UK, the US, Canada and New Zealand. When it comes to soft drink, a 2-litre bottle of Coca-Cola is more than double the price in Australia compared to the US. And if you're a fan of burgers, it'll cost you 70 cents more to buy a Big Mac here compared to America. So why are Aussies paying so much? Saul Eslake is the ANZ Bank's former chief economist and he joins us now. Saul, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Now, after crunching the numbers this week, it appears that we are paying more for a lot of items, and anyone who's travelled overseas and to places like America will know that that is true. How can the cost of a Big Mac vary so much from country to country?
Well, some of it's due to the strength of the Australian dollar. If you used not today's exchange rate, but say the average exchange rate of the last 10 years, which for the US dollar would be about 75 cents, then a good deal, though by no means all of the differences between some of the prices you quoted a moment ago, would disappear. So just as Australians find that things are remarkably cheap these days when they go to, say, London or New York compared with what it would have been 10 years ago, so correspondingly things in Australia are more expensive if they're converted back into British pounds, US dollars or even New Zealand dollars. But that doesn't explain all of it. Some of it's due to differences in wage costs, for example. In retailing, typically Australian retail workers are paid between about $17 and $24 an hour. In the US, typical retail wages are as low as $7 an hour. That doesn't explain the difference with Britain, where in many cases their wages are at least as high as ours, but in some other countries it's a factor. Cost of space that retailers occupy is another factor. Typically, Australian retailers pay higher rents for floor space than they do in the United States. That's partly because of where stores are and the scale or size of which they operate. On the other hand, there are some things that I just can't explain, for example, in relation to the price of bread. Given that wheat is the biggest ingredient of bread, it's really surprising that the two places in your survey where bread is by far the most expensive are Canada and Australia, which are the world's biggest wheat exporters. That's a real mystery to me.
There's something in that, isn't there? Saul, as a result of Australia's natural disasters, fruit and veg prices have jumped. Is this fair on families, do you think?
Well, I can understand why many Australian families would think it's unfair. It's obviously a matter of supply and demand, with the floods and cyclones having taken out a large proportion of the domestic supplies of many fruit, bananas being the most obvious example, but tomatoes are another example in the case of vegetables. Demand and supply inevitably push prices up. But this is a price Australians are expected by their governments to pay for keeping out allegedly exotic pests and diseases that might accompany imported fruit from other countries.
Saul, we have to talk about petrol. There has been an uproar, particularly this week, the rising costs is saying it's going to reach $1.50 a litre. Are we actually paying more than the rest of the world, or is this a universal thing?
Well, hard though it is for many Australians to believe, we actually have the 4th cheapest petrol in the Western world. Now, obviously, if you go to major oil-producing nations like Venezuela or the countries of the Middle East, petrol is cheaper than bottled water. But in most Western countries where taxes on petrol are substantially higher than they are here in Australia, your typical motorist pays a lot more for petrol. It's really only the United States and Canada among Western countries where petrol is cheaper than in Australia. If you go to the UK, for example, as your survey shows, you're paying well over $2 a litre for petrol there.
OK, it's fascinating. Saul, thank you for coming on and talking to us about this.
Thank you very much for having me.
See you soon.
I'm so glad we got around to talking about bread and fruit, because for a moment there I thought Big Macs and Coke were our staple foods.
Like the Americans. But it's very interesting to me because last year, obviously, my sister got married in Italy.
Yes.
Going shopping in Rome, you walk around for a day and a half just being angry about how much we pay for things in Australia, and then you just start shopping like crazy. Things are so cheap overseas.
Indeed,
And
Sammy.
Somebody is making a lot of money.
Particularly with fruit. I mean,
to Rome.
you know, we all want fruit to be cheap, but you can't expect fruit to be good if it's coming from the United States or
and
a ship.
you can't expect to have avocados all year round.
Exactly.
If that's what you want to,
Each
pay
season.
more because they don't exist all year round. So
Same with Italian handbags. You know, they don't exist all year round, Sam. Some in the beginning of summer, some in the beginning of winter, all right? Busy half hour coming your way, including...